In late April of 1770, the coast of what is now New South Wales came into sharp focus for the crew of His Majesty's bark Endeavour, commanded by James Cook. They entered a wide inlet known today as Botany Bay, called Kamay by local people, and prepared to go ashore. What looked, from the deck, like a calm landing place was already a contested space, watched by those who lived there. Cook's voyage had layered purposes: navigation, observation, and the claiming of knowledge for an expanding empire. As the ship moved north along the coastline, the crew searched for safe water, timber, and a beach where a boat could land without breaking. Yet safe meant one thing to sailors, and another to the Gweagal, who understood the bay as home, law, and livelihood, not an empty stage for strangers to enter. On the 29th of April, 1770, a boat approached the shore at Kamay. 2 Gweagal warriors stepped forward to block the landing, carrying spears and showing clear intent: "Do not come closer." In the British accounts, the men appear first as a barrier, then as a problem to be solved. From the beach, the warriors saw armed strangers arriving by water, a threat that could not be negotiated on equal terms in that moment. The distance between the boat and the sand became the whole world. The British called out, made gestures, and displayed goods, trying to signal trade or peace. But the message did not bridge the reality of an intrusion. The 2 warriors held their ground and continued to resist. Their stance was not theatrical, it was practical defense. In a few heartbeats, the encounter narrowed from contact to confrontation, with neither side willing to yield the shoreline. Cook, as commander, carried responsibility for the landing and for the safety of his men, and he also carried assumptions shaped by naval discipline and imperial habit. In his decision-making, refusal on the beach became an obstacle to mission objectives. The British prepared firearms not to fight a battle, but to force space. The logic was coercion: create fear, break resistance, secure the shore, and move forward under control. The British fired small shot, a discharge meant to sting, scatter, and intimidate rather than to kill at once. The sound, smoke, and impact were a new kind of violence in that place, louder than any shouted warning. One of the Gweagal men was struck and wounded. The injury, recorded in British notes, marked the turning point. It changed the balance from a contest of will to a demonstration of lethal capacity, even if death did not follow. After the wounding, the British were able to step onto the sand and establish the first foothold of their visit. This was not a handshake moment. It was an entry achieved through force. The beach, a boundary in Gweagal terms, had been crossed under duress. The crew's immediate priorities, fresh water, plants, observations, continued, but the meaning of the landing had already been set by the opening exchange. Resistance met by gunfire. The names of the 2 warriors are often not preserved in the written record, a silence that itself tells a story about whose identities were considered worth recording. Yet their actions became influential far beyond that morning. They stand as one of the earliest symbols of armed resistance to the first waves of British contact on the eastern coast. In later memory, the scene is revisited not as a minor skirmish, but as a first warning shot of a long frontier. To tell this history as documentary is to hold 2 perspectives at once without smoothing the edges. From the ship's side, the landing is described as necessary and controlled, a decision taken to protect sailors and fulfill orders. From the shore's side, it is an invasion moment, answered with a clear refusal and a readiness to defend country. The same event produces 2 narratives, one of making landfall and one of fighting off strangers. This first part sets the stage for what follows. how the Endeavour's crew moved through Kamay after the forced landing, how observation and extraction unfolded alongside fear and mistrust, and how later generations turned a brief clash into a defining symbol. In the next part, we will walk the shoreline with both lenses, naval log and living country, to understand how a single morning's violence echoed into policy, memory, and the story Australia tells about its beginnings. After the forced landing at Kamay on the 29th of April 1770, the Endeavour's crew began to behave as visiting professionals, sailors securing boats, officers measuring distances, and naturalists scanning the landscape for specimens. Yet the ground under their boots was not neutral terrain. The first minutes on shore were shaped by the fact that entry had been gained through gunfire and injury. Every later action, collecting water, cutting wood, walking inland, rested on that first coercive step. The British party moved with caution and routine at the same time. They carried muskets, not only for hunting, but as a visible claim to control. They expected that once a landing was achieved, the shoreline would become theirs to manage. This expectation mattered because it framed local resistance as disorder rather than as defense. The gap between those ideas, defense and disorder, would widen across the following decades, becoming a permanent argument about whose laws applied on the coast. For the Gweagal and neighbouring communities, the beach was not simply a strip of sand. It was a threshold where resources were gathered, canoes were launched, and obligations were held. A boat landing without permission could mean theft of food, violence, or the start of something worse. The two warriors' decision to confront the landing party was therefore a rational act under uncertainty. Their spears were not ceremonial props. They were tools of survival and authority. British records describe attempts to communicate, gestures, calls, offers of trinkets. But communication is not the same as consent. A sailor can hold up cloth and still be an armed stranger, stepping onto someone's home ground. When the Gweagal men did not retreat, the British response exposed the hierarchy of power in the encounter. Firearms were used to change the outcome. The use of small shot made the message brutally clear. Resistance would be punished, and the beach would be taken. Once the British were ashore, they began naming and interpreting everything through their own categories. They described the landscape as a place to be observed, mapped, and recorded. They looked at plants, birds, and soil because their mission rewarded collection and classification. But the very act of discovering a bay already lived in and known to others contained a quiet violence. It replaced local meaning with imperial description. In documentary terms, this is where science and conquest start to overlap. The landing at Botany Bay is strongly associated with the naturalists Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander, who collected large numbers of plant specimens during the Endeavour's stay. Their work would help shape European knowledge of Australia's flora, and it would help justify the significance of the bay in British imagination. Yet the same shore that produced celebrated botanical collections was also the site where British weapons had been used to break local refusal. The legacy is split: discovery for one audience, dispossession for another. The wounded Gweagal man disappears quickly from the British narrative after the moment of injury. That disappearance matters. The logs focus on the expedition's progress, not on the human consequences on the beach. This is a pattern that repeats across early colonial records. Indigenous people appear at the moment they obstruct, then fade into the background when the mission continues. The absence of names and detailed accounts is not an accident. It reflects whose suffering counted in official memory. Even within the Endeavour's discipline, there were choices. Cook's leadership style relied on order and control. and he often tried to prevent reckless violence among his men. But the decision to fire, whether framed as warning or necessity, still crossed a line. It turned the encounter into an early example of how British authorities would treat refusal as something to be overridden. In later decades, similar logic would justify punitive raids, forced removals, and the policing of indigenous movement. The pattern begins small, then scales. To understand Kamay's clash as history, we have to see it as a first contact moment and as a rehearsal for frontier dynamics. The British assumed they could approach, land, and take what they needed. The Gweagal assumed they had the right to stop strangers, to defend the shoreline, and to enforce boundaries. When those assumptions collided, weapons decided the immediate result. But weapons did not decide the meaning. The meaning kept changing, depending on who told the story and why. In the next part, we will step back from the beach to the sources that shape what we think we know. Cook's journals, later retellings, museum interpretations, and the ways indigenous memory and place name keep the event alive. We will examine how a brief confrontation became a symbol, sometimes reduced to a footnote, sometimes expanded into a foundational scene, and why the struggle over interpretation is, in its own way, another continuation of the conflict that began on that sand. The story of the clash at Kamay on the 29th of April, 1770, reaches us through layers of narration, most of them written by the visitors. Cook's journal, officers' notes, and later published accounts set the frame. A landing, an obstacle, a decision, and a successful step onto shore. These texts were never neutral diaries. They were instruments of empire, meant to record competence, justify actions, and turn an unfamiliar coastline into a place that could be described, claimed, and eventually governed. In those British records, the two Gweagal warriors are often reduced to a brief scene. Two men with spears resisting, shots fired, one man wounded, the landing achieved. The emphasis sits on the expedition's continuity, what the crew did next, what they collected, what they observed. The men on the beach do not become full characters with names, kin, or history. That narrowing is not simply lack of information, it is a choice of focus. The written archive tells us as much about British priorities as it does about the event itself. Museums and libraries today hold these records and interpret them for the public. When an institution labels Kamay's clash as one of the earliest moments of armed resistance on the eastern coast, it is doing more than summarizing. It is reshaping the national memory of first contact, moving it away from soft myths of peaceful discovery and toward a recognition that force appeared immediately. The clash becomes a marker, not a later breakdown of relations, but an opening note of conflict. Yet the archival problem remains. The names of the warriors are rarely preserved in the British text, and that absence makes it easier for the scene to become abstract. A documentary must resist that abstraction. The lack of names does not mean the men lacked identity. It means the record failed to carry it. The warriors belonged to a community with laws, duties, and knowledge of country. They were not anonymous figures, even if the archive renders them so. A responsible retelling must say plainly that the archive has a bias, and that bias shapes what we can know. There is also the question of language. Botany Bay is the British name chosen for scientific reasons. Kamay is a name rooted in place and people. When we choose one name over the other, we choose a viewpoint. In practice, the coastline can carry both names, but the balance matters. If the story is told only in British terms, the encounter becomes a chapter of exploration. If it is told with indigenous place and perspective included, the encounter becomes a story about intrusion, defense, and the beginning of a long argument over sovereignty. Over time, the Kamay clash has been retold in school lessons, popular history, and commemorations. Some versions present Cook as measured, firing only to warn and avoid killing. Others present the act as a clear display of violence used to force entry. Both narratives can be built from the same sparse notes, because the notes leave room for interpretation. Was the shot meant as a deterrent or as punishment? Did the British exhaust all non-violent options, or did they move quickly to coercion? The answers often reflect the storyteller's broader beliefs about colonization. What is harder to dispute is sequence and consequence. Two men resisted, shots were fired, someone was wounded, and the landing happened. That sequence matters because it sets a precedent. It shows that early contact was not merely curiosity and trade. It contained power, threat, and the willingness to harm. Even if the British did not pursue further violence in that exact moment, they established a rule. The expedition's needs could override local refusal. This logic would later harden into doctrines of possession, property, and policing. Indigenous memory does not rely on shiplogs to recognize what happened. The bay, the beach, and the surrounding country hold story through naming, oral tradition, and ongoing connection. Those forms of record are often treated as secondary by colonial archives, but they are primary in the lives of communities. A documentary can acknowledge that there are histories carried outside paper. Memory embedded in place, passed in families, reinforced by the continuing presence of people on their own country. The clash at Kamay, therefore, sits at an intersection, written imperial record and living indigenous continuity. For a viewer, the most important insight may be that first contact is not a single truth, but a contested narrative. When the only detailed record comes from the party that arrived with guns and later claimed the continent, we must read that record carefully. It tells us what they did, but it also tells us what they chose not to see. In the next part, we will connect Kamay to the wider pattern that followed. How the British returned as settlers changed the stakes, how moments of resistance were met, and how the early logic of coercion matured into a frontier system. The beach confrontation becomes a prologue, not because it caused everything that followed by itself, but because it reveals, in miniature, the structure of conflict that would shape the coast for generations. After the Endeavour departed, Kamay did not remain a quiet footnote. The encounter on the 29th of April, 1770, sat in the background of later decisions because it revealed two truths that would define what followed. First, indigenous people would resist intrusion. Second, British authorities were willing to use force to override that resistance. When the British returned, not as explorers but as settlers, those truths collided at a much larger scale. In the late 18th century, the British establishment in New South Wales depended on the assumption that land could be occupied and controlled. That assumption required a story, that the coast was open for taking, that local people could be moved aside, and that violence could be framed as security. The Kamay clash offered an early example of that framing. A landing achieved after gunfire could be written as a necessary action by a disciplined commander. In practice, it was a demonstration that British priorities came first. As settlement expanded, the coastline and river systems became contested corridors. Fishing grounds, water sources, and paths were disrupted by camps, fences, and military patrols. Resistance was not a single uprising, it was a continuous set of choices: refusal, warnings, theft of supplies to survive, attacks on livestock, and at times, direct strikes against armed parties. British response hardened into a pattern: punish, deter, and claim order. The logic of the beach makes space with weapons, scaled into policy. It is important to avoid a misleading simplification. The clash at Kamay was not the start of war as a formal declaration. It was the first recorded fracture in a relationship that could have taken many paths, but soon narrowed into conflict because settlement brought permanent dispossession. What the beach moment shows is the power imbalance at the first meeting. Once a gunshot is the tool used to resolve refusal, future encounters are haunted by that knowledge. Trust becomes nearly impossible, because the cost of being wrong is injury or death. Within British narratives, Cook was often portrayed as relatively restrained compared with later frontier violence. That may be true in certain comparisons, but it does not erase the essential point. Restraint still included shooting at men defending their country. Restraint still carried the assumption that the expedition had the right to land. For indigenous communities, the distinction between warning shot and real shot can collapse, because both carry the same message: your boundary will not be respected if it blocks imperial movement. The Kamay clash also became a symbolic resource for later Australian storytelling. In older celebratory versions, it could be minimized as a brief misunderstanding resolved without deaths. In more critical readings, it becomes evidence that violence was present from the beginning and that the national origin story cannot be told honestly without it. Museums, education projects, and public commemorations have increasingly moved toward the second reading, not to shame the past for sport, but to correct a narrative that erased indigenous agency and suffering. Agency matters here. The two Gweagal warriors did not appear, in history, as passive observers. They acted. They chose resistance, and that choice is why the encounter matters. Their stance is influential precisely because it rejects the myth of passive welcome. It also exposes how British records often treat indigenous resistance as a problem, not as politics. In documentary terms, the scene becomes a lesson in perspective. The same action can be labeled hostile by an invader and protective by a defender. When we widen the lens further, we see Kamay as part of a global pattern of maritime empires. Explorers arrived with scientific goals and economic interests, but also with disciplined violence. The edge of a continent was never just a place to sketch and sample. It was a place where authority was tested. If local people could stop a landing, the voyage's objectives could be delayed or denied. So the empire built a habit. If persuasion fails, intimidate. If intimidation fails, injure. If injury fails, escalate. The beach confrontation fits the first steps of that ladder. The moral weight of this history is not abstract. It lives in how Australia debates its beginnings, its commemorations, and its responsibilities. A documentary on Kamay can show that the frontier did not start deep inland decades later. It began the moment a boat approached a guarded shore and chose gunfire as the solution. That does not mean every later act was inevitable, but it does mean the relationship began under coercion, and coercion tends to reproduce itself. In the final part, we will return to Kamay itself, how the site is remembered today, how institutions present the event, and how to tell the story with accuracy and honesty when the archive is uneven. We will also close by asking what first contact should mean in public memory. Not a romance of discovery, but a clear-eyed account of resistance, violence, and the long consequences that flowed from one wounded man on a beach. In the present day, Kamay is not only a bay on a map, but a place where memory is argued over in public, in classrooms, and on the shoreline itself. The encounter on the 29th of April, 1770, is often described as brief, yet its meaning is long. 2 Gweagal warriors refused entry, and the British answered with gunfire that wounded a man. That sequence forces a question. What kind of beginning was this? A documentary ending has to return to the basic reality that the earliest contact was not a clean meeting of equals. It was a meeting shaped by weapons and authority. The British could choose to stay offshore or to press forward. They pressed forward. The Gweagal men could choose to retreat or to defend. They defended. When the shot was fired, it did more than pierce skin. It established a lesson about power that later settlers would repeat across the continent. For many years, popular storytelling softened this scene into a misunderstanding, as if violence were accidental and quickly resolved. That softening helped protect a national myth of discovery as mostly peaceful, with conflict arriving later. But Kamay does not fit that myth. The moment resistance appeared, coercion appeared with it. Even if the British framed the discharge as warning, it still functioned as forced compliance. Telling the truth here does not require exaggeration. It requires refusing to look away from the wound. The absence of the warriors' names in many written accounts is part of the violence of the archive. The record remembers Cook's authority in detail, but it often reduces the defenders to faceless figures. A careful film can counter that by emphasizing what is known. These were Gweagal men defending their country, using the tools and responsibilities available to them. Their influence is real precisely because they acted first, openly and dangerously, against strangers who arrived armed and confident. Place names become a battleground of interpretation. Botany Bay speaks to European science and collecting, while Kamay speaks to belonging and continuity. Using both names is not a compromise for style. It is a statement of truth. The Bay can hold more than one language, and history can hold more than one viewpoint. When we say Kamay, we admit that the shore had owners before it had a British name, and that the landing was not a neutral visit. Museums, libraries, and public historians now present the event with sharper clarity, often describing it as among the earliest recorded acts of armed resistance on the eastern coast. That shift matters because public memory shapes policy and identity. If the origin story is only exploration, then dispossession can be treated as an unfortunate side effect. If the origin story includes resistance met by gunfire, then the nation must confront that coercion was not an accident of later settlement. It was present at the threshold. This does not mean the documentary must turn Cook into a cartoon villain or the warriors into mythic heroes. It means showing the machinery of decision. A commander prioritizing mission and control, sailors relying on discipline, and defenders enforcing boundaries at a place of deep importance. The moral weight lies in the imbalance. One side arrives with ships and firearms and the power to return. The other stands with spears and local knowledge and risks everything by refusing to step aside. The long consequence of that imbalance is visible in what followed in New South Wales. Settlement, fences, patrols, punitive actions, and the steady narrowing of indigenous space. Kamay is a prologue because it reveals the pattern in miniature: approach, refusal, force, and then the story continues as if force were merely a tool. A documentary can end by making that pattern legible, so the viewer recognizes how quickly violence can become routine when written as necessity. Yet Kamay also carries another truth: continuity. The Gweagal were not erased by one shot, and country does not forget its people. Memory lives in families, in language, in ceremony, and in place itself. The shoreline that saw the landing is still there, and the act of naming it Kamay is itself a form of historical correction. The documentary ending should make space for that endurance, because endurance is part of the story of resistance, not a footnote after it. The final image, then, is not the Endeavour sailing away, but the beach as a contested threshold, past and present layered together. Two warriors stand against a boat, a commander chooses gunfire, a man is wounded, a landing is secured. From that moment, Australia's first contact story cannot honestly be told as gentle discovery. It begins with refusal, injury, and the assertion of power. To remember Kamay truthfully is to admit that the frontier starts at the waterline.